All right, so today we will be doing the web store hackathon. There are instructions on how to do it in the curriculum app. I believe the lesson is called Web Store Hackathon. I think it encourages you to do a web store that sells either books or music albums. I think you can actually do it. You can make a web store to sell whatever you want. I think an important part of the exercise is that you should choose an item where you have some information to display about the item. So, a few data points that you can get some practice formatting data in a way that's pleasant to a user. So like title with books, title, author, price, the year it was made, a short description of the book. And also, I think it's important that you choose an item that's not just one item, but is something where you can display multiple different versions, or like with books or albums, multiple different books, multiple different albums, because there's some value in learning how to repeat the same thing over in a web page without having to manually code each of those different elements. But before we jump into that, I wanted to give a short lecture on problem solving and pseudocoding, and just how to approach problems that you haven't seen before. This skill is, just in general, it's a helpful skill for solving engineering problems in general. It's also very helpful for interviews. I think, a lot of students ask me like, oh, what is the Hack Reactor interview going to be about, let's say. And while I think there are maybe topics that you can study to prepare you specifically for that interview, it's much more important to, be able to approach problems you haven't seen before, break them down into smaller problems, and solve them in a systematic way. It's also very important to be able to communicate about what you're thinking in a clear and lucid way while you're solving that problem. Even when you run into roadblocks where you may not know what you're going to do next, it's important to be able to communicate about what ideas you're having and where you might see flaws with those ideas. So I'm going to go ahead and solve two problems that come from the function exercises earlier this week. All right, so the first problem I'll be solving is a variation of the FizzBuzz problem. Some of you may have seen this before. And the first thing that I want to talk about is how to, well, A, how to break down problems into smaller problems, and B, how to pseudocode. So pseudocode is an approach to coding where you talk about a problem using English before you start to actually write it out in code. And this allows you to, sorry about that. This allows you to conceptualize that problem in a more holistic way before you just jump in and try to write one line of code. I see a lot of students that think that they need to understand what every line of code in the solution is going to be before they can write one line of code in the solution. And pseudocoding frees you from that, where you can just kind of generally talk about what's going to happen in the problem, so that when you actually do go to code, it's much more clear what each line needs to do. And a good rule of thumb for pseudocode is that each line of pseudocode should correspond exactly to one line of code. So you might start from a higher level place, but as you write the pseudocode, you can break it down more line by line. And another thing that you'll notice as I write it, I visually structure it with the same hierarchy as code when I actually write the code. So if I have an if block, the conditional is going to be on one line, and then when I write the code inside it, I'm actually going to indent it in the way that I would with the code. All right, so the problem that I'll be solving right now is to write a function which takes an array of numbers and replaces each element of the array with the word fizz if that number is divisible by 3, and buzz if it's divisible by 5. If the number is divisible by both, it replaces it with fizzbuzz. All right, so there's a few things even before I think about how to solve this particular, how to work with like fizzbuzz and figure out if it's divisible by certain numbers that I can get from the instructions. First off, I'm going to write a function, so I know that I can structure out a function. Oftentimes, instructions will give you what to name it. I didn't happen to write that in these instructions, but I'll call it fizzbuzz. So I know that I'm going to write the function, so I'll just structure out a function body. I know that much. And I know that the function takes an array of numbers. So I need to define one parameter where it can take that array and work with it. All right, so what else do I know about this? Well, we know we need to inspect each element of the array, so we're probably going to have to iterate over the array. So with pseudocode, I might write iterate over array. All right, so now we have that iteration going on. That could, maybe it'll look like a for loop. Maybe I'll be using for each. I'm not sure yet, but at a conceptual level, I know I need to iterate. And then something needs to happen at each iteration. So let's see. I need to, determine if it's divisible by 3 or 5 or by both of those. And then once I do that, if it is, I need to replace that element with either fizzbuzz or fizzbuzz. All right. So this is just kind of a high-level approach to it, but I'm going to break down this a little bit more. So it seems to me that I will have to determine if it's divisible by 3 and by 5 as two separate pieces. Those would be two different conditional blocks. So if it is so you want to try to be specific. At each iteration, we're going to be working with one element of the array. So I'll say if the current element is divisible by 3. Cool. So looking at this seems to me like a very clear if block. Like we have a clear conditional there. And I have an idea of how I could achieve that with a line of code. So now I need to figure out what happens if it is divisible by 3. The current element is divisible by 3. I want to, let's see, I want to assign that current element to the word fizz. And I think I can do roughly the same thing with 5. If the current element is divisible by 5, assign current element to buzz. All right, now we have one more case. If it's divisible by both. So if the current element is divisible by both, assign current element to fizzbuzz. Now, one more case that we haven't inspected is those numbers where it's not divisible by either. So I might say, if else, if not divisible by either, don't do anything. So it's helpful to write that out. I know, having solved this before, that and also just kind of looking at it, if I'm not going to have to do anything, I actually don't have to write that condition. We just won't do anything with that element if it doesn't meet one of our other conditionals. And one thing that I think is missing in the instructions, which would be a good question for an interviewer, you always want to ask, what kind of an input am I getting, and what kind of an output am I returning? So, I might ask, hey, do you want me to be console logging each of these elements? Should I be pushing them to a new array? Should I be mutating the original array? In this instance, I'm going to make the decision that we're going to mutate the original array and then return it. So at the end of the outside of our iteration, we will return the array having mutated it. And that's another important thing, is that when you run into a question, it's always okay. It's not only okay, but it's very encouraged in most interview situations to ask as many questions as you can to find out what the situation is. I'm not going to handle it here, but often you want to ask, like, hey, what should I do if the user doesn't give me an array? What if they give me a string instead? Should I return, if not array, we might return an alert that's like, please enter an array of numbers. Or what happens if one of the elements in the array is not a number? That would be a valid question to ask, and maybe we would just not operate on that element. For the time being, I'm actually not going to worry about those edge cases. I'm just going to handle an array of numbers and assume that we have only numbers. Another really valid question for this particular problem would be whether we ever receive negative numbers. All right, so now I've got my pseudocode written out, and it looks like a pretty complete solution. But before I actually go to code, I'm going to walk through it line by line and figure out what's going to happen. I'm going to go ahead and add an example array here, just so that I have something to work with. So let's just imagine that we're given this range array. So we're going to iterate over array. In the first iteration, we're going to have 1. 1 is not divisible by 3, not divisible by 5, and so it's not divisible by both. So we won't do anything with that. The next iteration will have 2. And again, it's not divisible by 3 or 5, so nothing will happen. In the, let's see, in the next one, we'll have 3, which is divisible by 3, so it will be assigned to the current element phys. And if so this brings up a question that I hadn't thought about. Are these all separate if statements? In which case, it would, even after it checks if it's divisible by 3, it's going to check if it's divisible by 5. And then also if it's divisible by both. So one way that I could go is to say, you know what, I'm actually going to write these as else if statements, so that only one of them will occur. And once one of them is fulfilled, it's going to skip over the rest. So you might, in an interview, you would walk through each of those steps and be like, okay, the first time nothing's going to happen. The second time nothing's going to happen. The third time, we are going to replace that element with phys. The fourth time, nothing's going to happen. The fifth time, we'll replace it with buzz. There is one case in this array that this is actually not going to work for us. So I'm going to jump ahead. When we get to 15, if we're using those else if blocks, can anyone see a problem that we might run into? Yeah, it's divisible by both, but it's only going to get the phys as it currently is. Cool. So we'd run into that and we'd say, okay, so I see that problem before it's going to happen. So maybe in this instance, instead of having that condition at the bottom, I'll put it at the top. So I might, another good thing to do is when you are trying to solve a problem, it's good to try to think of different ways to do it. So this seems like it would take care of that case of 15, right? because it would see that it was divisible by both. It would change it to FizzBuzz, and it would skip over the other two. There would potentially be another way to do it where you could just have the 3 and the 5 and have them as separate if statements. And maybe with the 5, you could add another internal if that was like if type of equals string. So we know that it's already been assigned to Fizz. Actually, I'm saying that, and it won't work because then we won't be able to test if the original number was divisible by 5. But it is valuable to consider different solutions while you're solving it rather than getting stuck in one. That especially becomes valuable when you run into problems where you think you have a solution and you start to move forward with it and realize that there's kind of an impasse or a reason that that particular version of the solution won't work. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and code this out. And you're going to see it's super easy because I've already got everything structured the way that I'm going to have the code structured. And since there's this kind of line-to-line correspondence between the pseudocode and the code, I can really just read one line of pseudocode and write the code that does it. So I want to iterate over the array. I'm going to use a for loop to do that. So if the current element, so the current element is going to be array I, is divisible by both. So first, we need to check if it's divisible by 3. And then we need to check if it's divisible by 5. Oh, this is a good point. I don't know if we've ever covered the modulus operator. So the % sign right here is called the modulus operator. And what it does is it returns the remainder of an operation. So for instance, if I said 8 modulus 2, that would return 0. But if I said 7 modulus 2, that would return 1 because we'd have a 1 left over after dividing 7 by 2. So that's what that operator does. So you can see up here I'm saying if the current element divided by 3 equals, or modulus 3 equals 0, so if it's exactly divisible and there's no leftovers, then I know it's divisible by 3. All right, so I have my if statement, and then I'm going to assign the current element to FizzBuzz. So I'll say array I equals FizzBuzz else if the current element again. I'm just going to copy and paste my conditional from up here. All right, so if it's divisible by 3, we know that we want to assign it to Fizz. We want to assign the current element to Fizz. Actually, I'm going to move this down just to stay with the pattern I've already got. All right. So I believe this should work as expected. Before I test it, does anyone see any problems? That's not a trick question. I believe it's always helpful to have input before you try to test something. All righty, cool. let's test it out. All right, cool. Looks like that solution works. Once again, there's probably some edge cases, like some negative numbers, maybe. Trying to think off the top of my head this would work with negatives. And also you might want to handle if the array elements are numbers or are not numbers, if they're strings or booleans or things of that nature. Cool. Are there any questions on pseudocoding, on interviewing or problem solving in this way? Or any questions about the FizzBuzz solution? Cool. And then one other question before I let you off. I have another problem that I was gonna do a solution for. I don't want to do it right now because I want to let y'all get into coding. But I have a solution for the nth Fibonacci number. So finding a number at in position in Fibonacci. And I made a solution not using recursion because you often see it using recursion. Can I get B's or P's in the channel if y'all want me to do a similar lecture at the end of the day, like the last 15 minutes to solve that? All right, cool. I will do that then. So let's see. I'll let y'all break off. I'll post a Zoom link in chat about 15 minutes before we wrap up today. And if you want to come watch that, you can. If you don't want to watch that, if you want to keep working on your own solution for it, I totally understand that. So yeah, just be warned that I will be working on that solution for the, you know what, I'll post it 20 minutes before we end class so that I can work on the solution, and then we can have a short wrap up at the end that doesn't cover that. Oh, thank you, Patrick. All right, yes, let me see how many people we have. I do want to break you into groups larger than 2. We have 17 people minus Jordan and myself. So we have 15 people. If you break into, let's see. I would like y'all to break into groups of 3 or 4. So ideally 4. I think we'll have one group of 3. And I will go make some extra spots on the whiteboard for you to do that. Are there any questions about the hackathon before I let you go? Alrighty then. Well, go ahead and jump on Slack and get into groups. And I'll let's see, at the beginning of the class on Monday, I'll let people present their projects if they want to. So yeah, go enjoy your hackathon, and I'll see you in about 2 hours.